Historical perspective on how the Native American diet has changed over the last 100 years. There's been quite a bit of change historically. We've gone from a hunter-gatherer society to a complete modern society where life is easy, food comes relatively easy. The difference is that our physiology is still the same. Our cultural beliefs and practices and behaviors are relatively the same, but what's changed is the availability of food. So we've come to a place of abundance. We've come to a place where there's a variety of food that has not been available in the past. We're talking about food that is higher in fat, higher in salt, higher in sugar, higher in carbohydrates. Traditionally, our diet consists of mainly protein with a supplementation of fruits and roots and herbs that are gathered. Also, traditionally we've done some trading and also some gardening where we've been able to get squash, beans, corn, and some of the traditional foods. Those foods were a supplement to the main diet of protein. The changes that have been coming over the last 100 years have brought about a lot of changes in our society as far as our health status. And so we've come into a place where we find that we have a higher prevalence of overweight and obesity and a higher prevalence of diabetes. Lately, within the last 10, 15 years, there's been an emphasis on looking back and saying our diet was pretty good back in those days, and kind of going back and reviewing, what was it like? Why is it that today's diet, causes all these health problems? So we do have this emphasis on looking back into our past diet and, trying to recapture or regain those. The problem with that is that there was a big difference between the times back then. Is our diet did consist of higher protein, which is great, but we also only had a certain amount and a certain availability. There was scarcity in the diet where that tended to monitor how much we ate and when. Whereas now we do have that option. We may have higher proteins, but we have the option to eat larger amounts, and we have the option to eat more often. So when we're teaching about the traditional diet, we try not to focus specifically on, there was more protein, but also for the fact that we did eat less and we ate less often, and we also had a higher rate of exercise where we were often more active. We had to actually go out and hunt and search, so there was more calorie expenditures during the day. So we compare that diet that we had in the past with the lifestyle that we had in the past as well. There's been a lot of efforts that within Native cultures for people to come in and to take those ideas and present them to the youth. Within the schools, I've seen booklets that have been passed out, and sort of these kind of hints back to the youth to, look towards the past and try to learn from those. We've also had some interventions where people have taken the diet of the past and sort of introduced that into diabetes prevention. I know Kibikanti, she is a dietitian, a Native American dietitian who's created a medicine wheel intervention, and that was specifically for diabetes patients. And she took the traditional ways of eating, and she incorporated that into kind of presenting that diet to diabetes patients, and there was significant improvement in their weight loss, and it kind of goes to show that Native Americans do respond to that typical diet that we have in the past. So, there's been quite a bit of studies on Native Americans in relationship to diabetes. The gist of it is Native Americans tend to have about a 3-fold increase in diabetes over the general population in the United States. And we can go into the many reasons behind that. And genetically, we are quite different. Culturally, we have different norms and behaviors when it comes to eating and the cultural aspects of that. But when it comes down to it, the culmination of all of these has kind of led to a state of real dire need in our communities to address these and to make changes. There are many efforts that are being set forth now to combat diabetes and obesity in Native American youth. Let me try that again.
That's a lot. That's a lot of slides.
Yeah. Okay. There are many efforts that are being set forth right now that are trying to reduce obesity within Native American youth. In particular, there's a lot of diabetes prevention programs that are run through either tribes or the Indian Health Service. Many of these are targeting youth because that's where the changes can be made, and in particular, increase of exercise and change of diet. The efforts are just beginning, and there's an opening for so much more to be done, focusing on the traditional lifeways and focusing on the cultural aspects that allow our youth to get to the stages where they are in need of these services is one of the aspects that we can research on. What we kind of try to present to youth is that, we had a certain way of living in the past, and that way of living was based on this idea of scarcity. When we had a buffalo hunt and the buffalo hunt was plentiful, we ate plentiful, so there was this sort of feast or famine idea. One of the cultural aspects that we have as Lakota people is that our elders often they withhold from themselves and will offer, to the children. Well, that makes sense physiologically when you consider that, elders have slower metabolism and have a less need, whereas children are growing and they have a greater need. So that cultural norm of, maybe an elder giving an extra bit of food or a treat to a child helps promote growth in that child and maybe helps prevent, overweight and obesity in that elder who has less of a need. We translate that over to the modern day where both the adult and the child are probably getting as much as they need. But when you still have that culture of indulgence and you offer the child, well, here's an extra treat, what you're doing is you're taking that physiological need and the basis of that was at one time beneficial, and now you're causing problems for that child because they no longer need that little bit of extra because they probably already have enough. And so we focus on those cultural aspects, where now we have to say, that was a cultural norm that at one time served physiologically, but now we need to take that norm and maybe transform it into treats that are not of food value, and maybe have that child focus on something that is, outside of nutrition and, more of a reward status. Within each reservation, with each tribe, they each will have its own intervention or its own process that they are doing to address this. Some of it is coming from the Indian Health Service. A lot of it is coming from tribal programs. I know on the Rosebud Reservation there is a diabetes prevention program that focuses its attention specifically on youth. And they have a lot of activities that involve youth where they're doing walks and runs, activity day events. They also do a lot of education, prevention outreach programs. They also go into the schools and work with the schools to give information and to also provide opportunities for activities for the students. On other reservations, there are similar programs, diabetes prevention and youth programs that are doing the same, and I think all of them come from the same place. There is a very high need, and I think the youth are really open to it. I think youth at this point are seeing a lot of the consequences of being overweight. They're seeing their grandparents and even their parents, as young as 30, 40 years old, going into diabetes and having consequences of diabetes with dialysis and kidney transplants and all of the consequences that come from that. So youth are really embracing, and not only that, the tribal programs and the Indian Health Service are seeing the need, and I think that in the future and even now as we speak, there are more and more things being offered, and hopefully things only get better. And we do sort of have a cultural rebirth. We have people now that are looking into our culture that maybe have not in the past, and a lot of the efforts where we're finding, it's kind of coincidentally, I think, or maybe not, that we're finding we're at this status in our health where we're at a crisis. You know, if we do not make changes in our culture, our life, you know, our native peoples are at risk. At the same time, we're finding ourselves at a place where our culture itself is being lost. So, you know, when we come to this place where those two events are at the same time and at the same place, we find ourselves inevitably looking back onto our past and saying, how can those past lifeways help us to continue on into the future, and how can we better ourselves through looking back at the past? So.